Hi there, biology students. Today I'm going to compare between dengue and malaria. So before I start talking about these two diseases, let's just have a check on the STPM biology syllabus. Here's the syllabus item from chapter 13, Infectious Diseases. Dengue is in 13.2, whereas malaria is in 13.5. Now, in my experience of teaching these two diseases, I have found that students tend to confuse between dengue and malaria when they are taught separately. This is because both these diseases share many similarities. So that's why in this video, I've decided to combine dengue and malaria so that you can note the similarities and differences between them. Now, for both of these diseases, as well as the other diseases discussed in chapter 13, all you need to know are the cause of the disease, the symptoms of the disease, the transmission of the disease, and also the prevention. So come, join me to learn more about dengue and malaria. For your information, there are altogether about 3,500 known species of mosquitoes. Now, could all of them be dangerous to humans? Gratefully, there are only 3 known species of mosquitoes that can cause harm to humans. These are mosquitoes from the genus Anopheles, genus Aedes, and genus Culex. And what's better? According to our STPM syllabus, we only need to know about the disease brought by Anopheles mosquitoes and Aedes mosquitoes. How do the Anopheles and Aedes mosquito look? At first glance, they look the same. But now that I mentioned, the one on the left is the Anopheles mosquito, whereas the one on the right is the Aedes. You can start to notice that there are distinct differences between them. Let's start with the Anopheles. The Anopheles mosquitoes are longer, and they are either brown or black in color. But what's most clear about them is that when they land on our skin, their abdomen is positioned at an angle of 45 degrees. In contrast, the Aedes mosquitoes are shorter in length, and you can clearly see the black and white stripes both on their abdomen as well as their legs. And what's interesting is that when they land on our skin, their abdomen actually rests parallelly. So the next time a mosquito bites you, take note whether it's an Anopheles or an Aedes or a completely harmless species. Another thing to remember is that the Anopheles tends to appear at dusk, night, and dawn, whereas the Aedes mosquitoes, they are flying around during the daytime. I'd like you to know that these mosquitoes are actually innocent. They do not cause a disease. Instead, they are what we call as vectors. Vectors are organisms that help to transmit harmful pathogens from one host to another. So in this case, the mosquito carries a harmful microorganism in its saliva and then transfers it from one human to another human, leading to an infectious disease. So now, what is in the saliva of the Anopheles and the Aedes? The Anopheles mosquito has a microorganism called Plasmodium falciparum in its saliva, whereas the Aedes has a microorganism from the genus Flavivirus. This genus of Flavivirus are viruses coming from different serotypes such as Dengue1, Dengue2, Dengue3, Dengue4. Even the plasmodiums also come from a variety of species, falciparum being the most popular, but you also have other types of plasmodiums such as Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium malariae, and Plasmodium knowlesi. Okay, but for exam purposes, it suffices for you to know one species. Now, these plasmodiums are actually protozoas. That means they are eukaryotes. As you can see, it has a nucleus. So it is like relatives to parameciums and amoebas. But this is of course harmful because the protozoa from the genus Plasmodium carries with it the disease called malaria. Meanwhile, the virus from the genus Flavivirus causes the disease dengue. So I remind you once more, the cause for malaria and dengue are not the mosquitoes at all. The mosquitoes merely transport the dangerous microorganisms. Therefore, malaria is actually caused by plasmodiums and dengue is caused by virus. Let's learn more about this. Now that we know the cause of dengue and malaria, let's move on to discuss about the symptoms. Now, when infected with these diseases, the patient will suffer from high fever reaching temperatures of 41 degrees Celsius. However, the fever pattern between malaria and dengue are completely different. In malaria, the fever pattern is cyclical, meaning that the patient will experience cold stage, hot stage, and sweating stage repeatedly. Now, this pattern of cold, hot, and sweating is not experienced immediately after an infected female Anopheles mosquito bites them. It actually happens much later, that is between 7 to 30 days after being bitten. That is why sometimes the fever is misdiagnosed, since the patient would not be able to connect the fever to the experience of being bitten by the mosquito. Anyway, the fever will have these 3 stages, in which for the first hour, the patient will be very cold and thus shiver, after which for 6 hours, the patient will be suffering extremely high fever. And then the following 4 hours, the fever will start to subside, but you will continuously sweat. So at times, the patients misunderstand and think that they have recovered. But then, after these 4 hours, they will start to shiver and the fever will come back once again. So if the patient monitors this pattern carefully, the patient will be able to come to the conclusion that they are infected with malaria. Now, in the case of dengue, it's different. It is not cyclical at all. The dengue fever is divided into 3 phases. The first 4 days, the patient will suffer the fever. Then the next 2 days is where it is most critical. And finally, the balance 4 days, the patient will actually be able to recover with the condition that the patient has a strong immune system. Now, the fever will appear much earlier, that is between 4 to 10 days after being bitten by an infected female Aedes mosquito. So say 1 week later, the fever starts to appear for about 4 days. Now, this fever is so high that it will actually cause severe headache, terrible pain behind the eyes, muscles, and joint pain. So that is why the dengue fever is also called the breakbone fever, because it's akin to having your bones being broken. So that's what they say. That's how painful the fever is supposed to be. Okay, after the 4 days, the fever will subside. But this is actually the most critical stage, because what's going to happen now is that the plasma in the blood capillaries will begin to leak out of the body. So this will cause rashes called PTK to appear on the skin. And if this is an infection that is happening the second time around, the poor patient can suffer from what is known as dengue hemorrhagic fever, DHF, or dengue shock syndrome, DSS. This, of course, if not treated or addressed in the early stage, can lead to death. However, if this is the first time the patient is being infected by the dengue virus, then the balance of the days will be a case where you recover from your illness, although there's going to be a slight fever, but you will be well and good after the 10 days. So these are the symptoms of malaria and dengue. Now let's sum up what we have learned so far. Both dengue and malaria are vector-borne diseases, whereby they are transmitted by mosquitoes. But the difference is that in malaria, the mosquito is from the genus Anopheles, whereas in the case of dengue, the mosquito is from the genus Aedes. The next difference is in the microorganism that causes the disease. For malaria, the microorganism is a protozoa from the genus Plasmodium, whereas for dengue, the microorganism is a virus from the genus Flavivirus. Now, based on symptoms, both dengue and malaria are similar, where the patient will suffer high fever at 41 degrees Celsius. But the difference is that they have different fever patterns. So, in my next BioWorld video, I will explain why dengue has a 3-stage fever cycle, whereas malaria has a 3-stage cyclical fever pattern. Until then, bye-bye.